I am excited because today we get to talk about zoning, we get to talk about signature buildings, and we get to talk about something that has been requested in Cities Skylines since before Cities Skylines even came out.
Every decision you make weaves a thread into the fabric of your city. But don't for a second imagine a smooth, seamless surface. Cities don't work like that. Instead, it's an urban patchwork marked by the realities of life and living. You'll create and stitch it together with zoning. Zoning lets you decide where people live and work. You create these residential, commercial, and industrial zones with zoning tools.
So this is a weird place to start with my little commentary, but I just want to say how much I appreciate that the cuts between the residential, commercial, industrial, and office zoning overlays were synced to the music. That was really clean. That's something that I don't know if, I'm sure people noticed, but that was really cool. That's the type of thing I try to do so many times when I'm editing something that has music in the background that's like a project like this. If I'm just putting music in the background of a video, maybe not, but I appreciate that. Whoever edited this video, that was really clean.
They work in a couple of different ways. Click and drag over cells on the map to zone large rectangular areas. Zone all adjacent cells with one click. Or get granular, zoning a neighborhood cell by cell. When you establish a city, you choose a map. The map's theme dictates if your city's buildings will have a North American or European architectural style. You can now use zoning tools to mix it up. Go on, sprinkle a little North American flair into your European city, or vice versa.
So building styles was something that I really appreciated right away as soon as I got my hands on Cities Skylines 2. You can actually switch out the style of buildings that you wish to zone on a cell by cell, so building by building basis, rather than doing it on a district by district basis in the way that you would in Cities Skylines 1. What that means is that in theory, if you really wanted to, you could build a district of row houses where every other house was a different style. So you could have North American, then European, North American, then European. It is just a button. It's basically a toggle between which style you want to build for your city. And I'm going to be honest, and this is maybe a little bit too forward thinking of me, I would love to see how this system gets expanded. I would love to see modders potentially sort of latch on to this little toggle and say, okay, you can toggle your North American ones, you can toggle your European ones, but then a modder goes and says, hey, I made a bunch of, Japanese style buildings. You can now toggle that, which I imagine would be a possibility for a DLC somewhere down the line as well. But again, that might be a little bit too forward thinking. But I am noticing a few systems in Cities Skylines 2 that definitely strike me as something that could be taken and expanded upon in expansions somewhere down the line, kind of like how Industries or Park Life or whichever one of those expansions came out first and sort of established the idea of the district thing that has been a part of the last few DLCs, kind of like that, kind of how they got a really good idea with that and just ran with it, and it worked so well for so many different expansions. I could see some things in Cities Skylines 2 kind of being like that. Some mechanics feel very expandable.
Okay, you know how zoning tools work, but what can you zone? Well, let's start with residential zones. The places and spaces where citizens relax with friends, raise families, and rest their heads night after night. There are now 6 residential zone types. 2 will be familiar: low-density housing, detached houses for single families, and high-density housing, tall towers packed with residents. New zoning types include medium-density row housing and medium-density apartment buildings. There's low-rent housing now, too. Huge apartment buildings with tiny apartments.
So if you've seen my Cities Skylines 2 gameplay video, or most of the gameplay that's been released so far, you're likely already aware of the row houses and probably the medium-density apartments as well. Honestly, out of everything we've seen and will see with regards to zoning, the row houses are probably my favorite of the bunch, both the EU and NA versions. But in fairness, I've always been a bit of a sucker for true wall-to-wall buildings in Cities Skylines, even before that option was added in the Plazas and Promenades DLC. I've always loved finding terraced houses on the workshop. I've always loved, whenever I'd use Move It, just pushing things together a little bit more, just because I guess I grew up in an environment where that was the case. I grew up in Ireland. I've visited London and different parts of the UK, and things are just very close together in the UK in general. So it's what I know. It's what I'm familiar with. So having row houses, it's just really cool. I just love it. It reminds me of home. I mean, nothing I have at home is that fancy. They're very, very nice and very expensive looking row houses in Cities Skylines 2, both the North American and European ones. But they're very nice, and they do still remind me of home. Just a home that I could only ever aspire to and not necessarily live in.
Finally, there's mixed housing. Here, residents live in apartments above ground floor shops. Mixed housing adds next-level realism because homes and shops rub elbows like most real-world city centers.
Now, first things first, a lot of the assets, buildings, and details that we're seeing in these shots are just absolutely beautiful, which is, I think, a compliment towards both the people responsible for designing the buildings themselves and also the people that put together the lighting engine in Cities Skylines 2. It's a really pretty looking game, and I still don't subscribe to the idea. I still see the complaints that, man, the game doesn't look that good, the graphics kind of suck. It's a city builder. It looks fantastic for a city builder. Anyway, perhaps more importantly, it is interesting that we're hearing what sounds like production chains being established in Cities Skylines 2. Something you might have seen during the various gameplay videos that have already gone out is that when you click on a business, you actually see what the business specializes in. You see what they sell. So it makes me wonder if there is a deeper simulation going on here than simply saying X number of businesses need Y number of industrial buildings. Again, this would be something that's a little more akin to transport management games, as we've talked about before in previous videos, but it would be really interesting, wouldn't it?
Ready to talk business? You'll create dedicated commercial zones where companies sell the locally produced and imported goods people need and want. Your commercial zones are also where citizens and tourists eat out, catch the latest blockbuster, and dance until dawn. You'll establish industrial zones with factories, workshops, and warehouses where businesses can store goods ready for distribution or export.
To be totally honest with you, offices took a little bit for me to get used to when playing Cities Skylines 2. And that's just because you're essentially dealing with one extreme or another. It's either low density buildings or high-rise, city center, New York type buildings. Don't get me wrong, they look good. I absolutely love them. It's just a bit of a change from Cities Skylines 1, where you basically determined the density and heights of your offices based on a combination of the building level, the district policies, such as no high-rises, and the district theme, such as the financial districts. With all of that said, and looking specifically at the still frame that we have right now, there does at least seem to be a lot more variety in the appearance of the offices, specifically their heights, at least when it comes to the higher density option. At the very least, this will lead to more dynamic and interesting city skylines.
You'll also develop office zones. Here you'll find small, low-density buildings with only a few businesses in operation. You'll also get the glittering, high-density towers that define your city's silhouette in the sky.
Circling back to my point from earlier about production lines, this once again makes it sound like there's maybe a little bit more going on under the hood than meets the eye. Now, by no means am I stating or speculating that Cities Skylines 2 is going to have systems akin to Transport Fever, where you're creating dedicated production and delivery lines from farm to factory to store to residence. But it does seem like it's toying with that idea, at least to give the illusion that that's actually what the game's doing. Now, in my experiments with the game so far, that's also what it just seems to be doing. That does change a little with the specialized industries, and we did get a nice look at how farms work just a moment ago, which is something that I sadly didn't get around to in my gameplay video, but I know a lot of other people did. So absolutely check those all out. There is a huge playlist of all the Cities Skylines 2 gameplay videos so far. I will try to remember to link it in the video description. But it is interesting because farms, forestry, and many of the other industries now just require you to place a main building and then expand a zone out from it where the goods will be produced. So in the case of farms, you just create a giant field. It's both good for production and for aesthetics. And it makes me really happy to think that I might never have to place 10,000 shrubs to simulate a farm ever again. That's something I did in Cities Skylines 1 a lot. That's something I technically did in my Cities Skylines 2 gameplay video. I spent an hour placing shrubs around a graveyard. It's nice that I'm not going to have to do that for farms at the very least.
Growing your city and zoning go hand in hand. Here's an example. You zone residential areas that boost the population, and with it, the demand for jobs. You respond by creating an industrial zone with factories where people get to work. Now, these factories produce goods, but they won't stay in business long without somewhere to sell them. You solve that problem by expanding commercial zones. You see? Each zone helps create the momentum you need to realize the city of your dreams.
And so we will conclude the feature highlights portion of this video by talking about signature buildings. Now, signature buildings in Cities Skylines 2 function similarly to the unique buildings and monuments in Cities Skylines 1, in that there are a variety of requirements to unlock them, and that some will be unlocked through regular gameplay, as actually happened a few times while I was working on Linden City, but others will require you to meet specific criteria in order to unlock them. Also, similarly to Cities Skylines 1, and as has been stated in the video already, they will provide a variety of benefits to your Sims, and at times to your entire city. What's interesting, though, is that they're free. Of course, I'm not going to complain about free, beautiful buildings, and let me tell you, they are absolutely gorgeous. But it's definitely a departure from the huge monetary investment that unique buildings and monuments would have in Cities Skylines 1.
And it wouldn't be the city of your dreams without signature buildings. These are unique residential, commercial, industrial, and office buildings that you unlock as your city expands. They're free to build, and you can plop them anywhere. Plop. It's City Skylines lingo. Go on, say it. Plop. What's so special about signature buildings? Well, they function like any zoned building. A home for people, a warehouse for industry, an office for workers. But they can elevate the neighborhood in unique ways. Signature buildings can also bring citywide benefits. Zone and place your signature buildings carefully so each city district flourishes and plays its part in the success of the whole city. Life's rich tapestry has never been richer than in Cities Skylines 2.
And so just before we get into the developer insights portion of the video, I want to talk a little bit more broadly about zoning and signature buildings, because I really just appreciate that this is, again, taking what we know from the first game and making it bigger and better in the second game. I also like that the signature buildings are a little bit more like rewards for things that you do. It kind of reminds me of how, and I hate to keep making this comparison, I did promise that I was going to try and stop, but it does remind me of how you would be rewarded in SimCity 2013 with your first town hall, which I think was free. And then also the mayor's mansion, the first time you build it, I think is also free. It's a similar vibe. It's a similar idea that you do a thing and you get a reward, and the reward is a building that looks cool and is unique, and that people also enjoy, and that has some benefits for your city. In the case of the town hall or city hall in SimCity, it was that you can unlock different types of buildings, and in the case of signature buildings in Cities Skylines 2, it might improve comfort, it might improve this, it might improve that. It's just, you know, again, similar to the unique buildings and monuments in Cities Skylines 1. I also, again, more broadly, just appreciate that the sense of scale in Cities Skylines 2 really just applies to every aspect of the game. So we're seeing, you know, zoning go up to 6x6 for the largest zone building as opposed to 4x4. And the buildings they do just look bigger. They are obviously bigger, but there's just something about it. Just the sense of scale in this game. This is going to sound really cliched, but I don't think it translates all that well to video. Something I noticed when I was watching a little bit of Cities Skylines 2 before I played it was that we would keep being told about the scale, and you can see it. You can definitely see it. But when you get in there and you start moving the camera around yourself and you see that, wow, the cemetery is huge compared to these houses, Wow, the international airport is enormous. Oh my God, the international airport is tiny when compared to the scale of the map. Every aspect of this game has just been scaled up from the first one, and that's apparent in zoning, it's apparent in the signature buildings, it's apparent everywhere, and I really appreciate that.
Okay, let's talk about zoning. We have the familiar tools returning, which are the fill tool, which fills the entire continuous zone with the selected zone type. Then we have the marquee tool, where you can select these rectangular areas and just plop a little zone there. You can also have the paint tool, which you can use to basically paint cell by cell to make the zones exactly the way you want.
Compared to CS1, in CS2, the dezoning tool is added to your mouse, and it's the right click on your mouse, so it's not a separate tool anymore.
You can even zone over existing zones.
Something I really appreciate about the Developer Insight videos is that they do really latch on to what was said in the feature highlights and go, hey, here's a little bit more, here's a little something extra. It really gives you a reason to watch the Developer Insights. And something I ended up appreciating in Cities Skylines 2 when I played it, and when I do play it, was the fact that it is a little bit more straightforward. You do just right click to get rid of some zoning, and you can just overwrite zoning that already exists. And that's something I was doing without really thinking about it. That was something I immediately started to take for granted. And then when I went back to play Cities Skylines 1 for the Vanillaville series, I realized it was at that point I went, oh, hold on a second. You can't do that in Cities Skylines 1. You don't overwrite zoning. You don't just delete it that easily. So I really appreciate that Cities Skylines 2 isn't just going bigger and better with everything. It is just a little bit more intuitive. It's a little bit more straightforward, and it's just a little bit easier to do what you want to do.
At release in Cities Skylines, we'll feature two architectural styles, North American and European. These styles include zoned buildings, service vehicles, road markings, and roadside props.
Notice that the words "at release" were used in that last segment. So that does imply to me that there might be some plans to have some DLCs with different building styles, and that will include vehicle styles, prop styles, road marking styles, and the like. And that's something that's pretty huge. That's a lot of things. And a lot of that is stuff that, again, I sort of took for granted when I played and when I do play Cities Skylines 2. The only thing I've noticed other than, well, I did notice the road markings, but I noticed the vehicles. I noticed that the emergency services had different vehicles based on the style that you used for your map. And it was cut out of my gameplay video, but there was a whole 5-minute bit of me just looking at all of the different service vehicles and going, oh my God, that police car's European. That ambulance is super European looking. Because in the tests that I'd done before recording that video, I'd played on a lot of North American themed maps, and I'd played around with a lot of the North American style buildings. So I hadn't noticed at that point that you do have European style vehicles, but you absolutely do. They look fantastic. We just got to look at them. And like was also said, the road markings change as well. And at launch, at the very least, there are two different styles. So let's just leave it at that. At launch, there are two. After launch, who knows?
In the first game, there were only 2 residential zone types. In the second game, we are introducing third level, medium.
We have medium density row housing, medium density apartment buildings, mixed housing with shops at the bottom and apartments at the top, as well as low rent housing.
Low rent housings are bigger buildings with small apartments. People who are living in these kind of buildings are students, young adults who have just moved out, or singles.
In a a previous episode, we talked about how pathfinding is based on a bunch of factors, and that includes whether someone is young, whether they're old, whether they're just an adult with no time to do anything. That's kind of a similar vibe to what I get here with the low rent housing, in the sense that it's, single people, it's students, etc., etc. I like that the demand for different types of zoning are going to be, or the demands from your people are going to be more in-depth than just, hey, we need more residential, and hey, it needs to be high density. I like that there's sort of an implication here that if you were to build a university and a high school, and just, well, I guess a university more so than a high school, but if you build a university, you might want to put low rent housing very close to it so that the students can afford to live there. I like that that's there. I like that that's something you might want to think about. And again, it just provides more depth to how you're going to build your city. It makes you think a little bit more. It makes things a little bit more interesting. And it does take City Skylines a little bit away from just being a broad city painter into a city management game, which in its own right was one of my complaints about the first game, is that the management aspect was a little bit weak. But in City Skylines 2, it definitely seems to be a lot stronger based on the fact that it does have that much more depth.
Mixed housing is a new zone type in City Skylines 2. It answers the demand for low commercial and medium density residential. These apartments are good for saving space because they have both the shops and the apartments.
The shop at the bottom of the building pays rent, so the residents of the building doesn't have to pay that much.
So I mentioned earlier that I can't really talk too much about the mixed use residential zoning because it wasn't a part of the gameplay video that I put out. I still can't really say too much about it, but I actually didn't know that it worked the way that it does. I didn't know that because the shop in the ground floor is paying rent, the people upstairs are paying a little bit less. So in its own way, that makes me think that the mixed use zoning is sort of a low rent kind of option. It makes me think that it might be kind of popular again for, well, obviously more downtown kind of areas, but also for places near universities, again, so that your students have somewhere a little bit cheaper to live, and they're, extremely close to shops because they're above them. I just like that it gives you more options. And honestly, just in a broad sense, I'm just glad it exists. I'm just glad it's a thing. I've wanted mixed use residential and commercial zoning for a very long time, and it makes me so happy that it's just in City Skylines 2.
The mixed housing buildings have the separate section for shops and apartments, and they can mix and match to create a large variety of combinations. The zoned industry has two categories of buildings. Most of the buildings are manufacturing companies, but there are also warehouses where these companies can store their produced goods before they are sent further into the commercial sector or other manufacturing companies or outside connections.
All right, so for the second time today, we're going to circle back to what I'd mentioned about production lines, and I think it's fair to say that based on the developer insights, this game maybe isn't quite to the standard that Transport Fever 2 would have, and that is something we mentioned just a little bit earlier, and that is okay. That is perfectly fine. I do like, though, that there is an aspect of inbuilt warehouses. I like that it's not necessarily something you need to go and manually build. I kind of like that the industrial zoning will sort of take care of that on its own, and the businesses will go, hey, we have a factory that's making all this stuff. We need a warehouse where we can store it. There's a warehouse where we can store it. We're going to store it in that warehouse, and then the goods are going to go from that warehouse to the commercial buildings and zones and all that good stuff. I like that there is that extra step in there. It makes sense. That's usually how things work when you're ordering from like Amazon, for example. You don't get it straight from the factory. It's sitting in a warehouse somewhere, and a little robot comes along, goes boop, 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 and picks up, I don't know what that was, and picks up your thing and puts it in a box. And another robot seals the box. I don't know if it is all robots. I'm pretty sure it's robots that pick it up, right? At least in some of like the mega Amazon. Anyway, we're going to go with the robot theory. And it gets put in a truck and then that gets delivered to you, right? There's a warehouse in between the factory and you. I like that. I think that's cool.
In City Skylines II, we have overhauled and improved on the zoning demand calculations. We have great tools for you to understand how to zone better. The system is now more complex, but not complicated. The game has a new feature called City Specialization Bonus. This means that companies working on same materials and producing similar goods, when placed in close proximity, these companies gain an increase in efficiency, which in turn increases their productivity and profit.
Once again, we're hearing about the interconnectivity of everything in City Skylines 2. We talked earlier about the signature buildings. I'm sure we're going to talk about them again in just a moment. But we talked about how they do have an impact on both the immediate vicinity around the building, but some of them can also have an impact on the city as a whole. Again, similar to the unique and monument buildings in Cities Skylines 1. I do like that that extends to industry, though. I like that you can say, hey, here's a factory that takes farmed goods, it takes crops, it takes forestry goods, it takes whatever. Let's build a farm relatively close to that factory so that the production line is going to be shorter and so that they have the efficiency bonus as a result. It obviously makes sense. It's sort of similar to the idea of City Skylines Industries, that one DLC that I absolutely adore and I've been playing around with a lot lately in the Vanillaville series. It's a similar concept because you can have your source of raw materials relatively close to your factories, or you can have them across the city, or you can put them wherever. There's no, I don't think at the very least there is an actual calculation for efficiency in City Skylines 1. I'm almost certain that there isn't, but obviously there is just the natural efficiency of having them relatively close together so that the journey time is a little bit less between, point A and point B. But in this case, there is also an actual bonus on top of just reducing the travel time for goods going from the source to the factory. I like that. I think that's cool. It's, once again, going to make it really interesting to build and lay out your cities. You're going to have a choice between building something that looks aesthetically pleasing, a nice city center surrounded by some suburbs, surrounded by some farms and some forests, or an industrial yard that has absolutely everything you could possibly want in it. It's not going to be aesthetically pleasing, but it's going to be efficiently pleasing. And I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to go back and forth with in City Skylines 2.
In City Skylines 2, land value system has been overhauled. This time, it's the citizens and companies that decide which areas are desirable in your city. And it is your job to provide them with the services and opportunities they need to live prosperous lives.
So to be honest with you, this is one system that I'm not too familiar with. I haven't actually played enough City Skylines 2 to have a full understanding of how land value actually works, but based on what's been said and based on my own first-hand experiences, I like the system in the game. It is kind of cool, it's kind of interesting, and it's definitely exciting to have chirps pop up from your people that are like, hey, buddy, healthcare is terrible. I like that there is that sense of communication between you as the mayor, I guess, of the city and the people that are living there. I like that they're going to tell you what they want, what they really, really want, and that you're kind of going to have to respond to that a little bit. Again, it takes the game from just being a city painter, which, by the way, you can still go nuts and just create the most beautifully detailed things in City Skylines 2, but it does just add another layer of management, and that is something that I can't stress enough. I love about City Skylines 2. I like that there is more of a management aspect. I like that you still can go and create these amazing things, but I like that the gameplay loop isn't an exact repeat of the first game, because how many times have we started cities in City Skylines 1? And within about an hour, maybe 2 hours, you are making enough money that you're sitting on $2, $3, $4 million, and you never really run out unless you make a massive mistake. This game doesn't quite do that. There is more of a balancing act, there is more management, there is more of a back and forth, and I really appreciate that.
The zoning tool also introduces zoning overlay. This includes information for the different zone types, where to zone them, and which places are not maybe the best places for them to be in. A new feature in City Skylines are the signature buildings. These are unique, ploppable zone buildings that decrease the demand of the zone type they are in. These buildings are unlockable. They usually have 2 to 3 different requirements before they're unlocked. In addition to contributing to the zone demand, they also have positive effects to their neighborhoods as well as the city as a whole.
And so that concludes the Developer Insights portion of the video, but not before, of course, we talk a little bit more about the signature buildings, which again, they are replacing the monuments and the unique buildings from Cities Skylines 1. They obviously have various perks as well. And as you can see, they do have an associated zone type with them. You can have signature residential buildings, you can have signature commercial buildings, you can have signature industrial buildings, and they do take away a bit of the demand that you would have for those things. So if you have, for example, a massive amount of, let's say, medium or high density residential demand, you can go and place a medium or high density signature building, and it will take away some of that demand because people do have to live there, and they do live there. And then, of course, on top of that, you have the bonuses from that building just existing, which again, it could be improved comfort, it could be whatever it is. I like this. I like that as a system. I like that it sort of takes the monuments, which the monuments in Cities Skylines 1 were cool. They absolutely were, but they were always very standalone buildings. They were, you know, museums, which admittedly museums and theaters and expo centers kind of are standalone things. They're things that you want to put on its own chunk of land with parking around it and public transport and all that good stuff. I like in this case that at least some of the signature buildings are supposed to be integrated a little bit more closely into your city. I like that some of them are supposed to go right next to row houses and towers and are just supposed to be sort of fancy looking apartment buildings. I like that a lot. I think that's a really cool way of doing the signature buildings, the unique buildings, the monuments, whatever we want to call them. They are signature buildings in Cities Skylines 2. So that's, I guess, what we're going to call them. And I suppose at this point, there's not really a whole lot left to say about zoning or the signature buildings. I think I've kind of got everything off my chest. So I want to open the floor to all of you, as we usually do with these videos. Let me know in the comments below what part of the zoning or the signature buildings or all of this that you are most excited about. We'll get a bit of a conversation going on down there about everything that we've seen so far today. And if there's anything that you're not sure about, go ahead and throw a question in the comments as well. I'll go through, and if I can answer it, I absolutely will. And we'll see once again if we can get a little bit of conversation going there and just see what we can do in terms of talking about zoning and signature buildings in Cities Skylines 2. Either way, thank you so much for watching, everybody. It has been an absolute pleasure, as always. And as always, I'll see you next time. Well, bye.